I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. I'm Will, and I'm the founding psychology member of the group hosting today's symposium. This symposium is the culminating event for what has proven to be one of the most valuable experiences of my graduate schooling. I will forever treasure the opportunity to exchange ideas with such a diverse and thoughtful group of individuals brought together by a passion for narrative identity. It's only fitting that in this context, I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, an innovative interdisciplinary thinker who created the most widely used protocol for researching narrative identity in psychology, Dr. Dan McAdams. Dr. McAdams is the Henry Wade Rogers Professor of Psychology and Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Beginning in May of this year, he will serve as the interim dean of Northwestern School of Education and Social Policy. Professor McAdams received his BS degree from Christ College, Valparaiso University in 1976, and his PhD in psychology and social relations from Harvard University in 1979. He has received numerous awards for teaching and was named a Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence at Northwestern from 1995 to 1998. The author of nearly 300 scientific articles and chapters, numerous edited volumes, and 8 books, Professor McAdams works in the areas of personality and lifespan developmental psychology. His theoretical and empirical writings focus on concepts of self and identity in contemporary American society, and on themes of power, intimacy, redemption, and generativity across the adult life course. Professor McAdams is a leader in the recent emergence within the social sciences of narrative conceptions of human lives, approaches that place stories and storytelling at the center of human personality. He has been funded by major grants from the Spencer Foundation and the Templeton Foundation. From 1997 through 2019, he was funded by the Foley Family Foundation to direct the Foley Center for the Study of Lives at Northwestern University. He is the 1989 winner of the Henry A. Murray Award from the American Psychological Association for research on personality and the study of lives, the 2006 Theodore Sarban Award for contributions to theoretical and philosophical psychology, and the 2012 Jack Block Award from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology for career contributions to personality psychology. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science. He served on the executive committee of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology and is a founding member of the Association for Research in Personality, for which he served as president from 2016 to 2018. His work has been featured in many national publications and media outlets, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and Newsweek, and he has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and many other television and radio venues. If you're interested in reading his work, as I'm confident you will be after his presentation today, you can pick up his books, The Strange Case of Donald J. Trump, A Psychological Reckoning, or The Redemptive Self, Stories Americans Live By. The former provides the first evidence-based psychological interpretation of the life and presidency of Donald Trump, aiming to explain how Mr. Trump has come to be the person he is. Surely a point of interest for many of you here today. The latter has received several awards, including the 2006 William James Award from the American Psychological Association for Best General Interest Book in Psychology across all subfields, and the 2007 Association of American Publishers Award for excellence in professional and scholarly publishing. Finally, on a more personal note, Dr. McAdams has influenced my career in a tremendous way. In the past several years, I have turned towards narrative theory and methodology as a means for understanding and nurturing whole persons. Dr. McAdams' pioneering research, along with the work of many others he has inspired, has provided a foundation for my efforts. I would not be the scholar I am today without his many contributions. Please welcome Dr. Dan McAdams.
Propaganda there. So I can scrap the talk and we can just talk about Trump. Well, we'll stick with the game plan, but happy to delve into that other topic anytime I'll do that. This is a talk about stories. So, once upon a time, I was a very young, brand new assistant professor at Loyola University, Chicago. And even before my student Ed D. St. Alban, Professor D. St. Alban, showed up on the scene, which means I am, yes, much older than I was. I was teaching classes back then in developmental psychology. And well, I don't want to tell you when it was, but here are some of the faces from that era. Actually, know when it was because Will outed me with the dates there. These are some of the faces, and one of them is still around. The rest of them kind of moved on. That was an incredible decade. Okay, so back then, teaching courses in developmental psychology, this was sort of, this man was, in a way, kind of my inspiration. Erik Erikson, famous psychoanalytic theorist from the middle years of the 20th century. And Erikson is well known, even in the general public, for many things. His 8 stages of development are still taught today in many classes across the curriculum. And his concept of identity was really a major idea in psychology. And Erikson described identity as an arrangement of the self, a sense of sameness and temporal continuity. It integrates who I am, who I was, and who I might be in the future. It emerges, this identity thing, it emerges in the adolescent years, or maybe a little after that. It starts to become an issue in people's lives. Whatever this thing is, this identity, it situates a person within a psychosocial niche, in adult society. It is constructed. You don't go to the mountain and discover your identity. You make it through interpersonal relationships, in culture, with a lot of the factors that impinge upon us that Professor Ortega talked about earlier today. I say, okay, that's all good, that's cool, but what is it? I taught a class in the summer with graduate students in developmental and clinical psychology, and we pondered the whole quarter, read all this stuff on self and identity, and we're thinking with Erikson here, if you could see an identity, like touch it, what would it look like? Right? And we played around with different metaphors. Well, maybe it would look like a circus, you know, it had 3 rings, or maybe it would look like an archaeological dig, or maybe, who knows, what would it look like? We never really came to a conclusion as to what an appropriate metaphor for identity might be in that class. But a few months later, started playing around with the idea that, well, maybe, identity is a story. Maybe if you could see an identity, maybe it would kind of look like a novel, right? Or maybe if not a novel, at least some kind of thing where there's an opening, there's a character who's motivated and wants things and pursues them over time. There are settings, scenes, themes, plots, maybe a kind of imagined future to the story. And that, yeah, I mean, stories kind of do some of the same things that Erikson said an identity does. Story, you know, if you have a story in your mind about who you are, it situates you in time. Oh, I used to be this, and now I'm this. And then I hope I might be that in the future, or I fear I won't be that in the future. So there's a kind of narrative thing going on there to provide your life with a certain sense of temporal continuity. A story situates you in the world. It captures the multiplicity of the self. Like, so I'm divided up, right? There's this Anglo part, right? And then there's this Latinx part. And maybe there's a third thing. And they're like, almost like characters in the story. Not quite, but does this metaphor work? I was wondering. So pursue this. This has really been my whole career, pursuing this idea that identity is like a story. And it's sort of morphed over the years into a concept that's common in many different fields. You all know about it, narrative identity. In personality and developmental science, we describe it as an internalized and evolving story of the self that explains how I came to be the person I am becoming. So your story incorporates a reconstruction of the past, how you remember it, completely reconstructed. It's not a tape playing. It's not veridical necessarily. It is an imaginative reconstruction of the past, an anticipation of where your life might be going in the future, put together in some kind of way to provide your life with some semblance of coherence and temporal continuity. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't integrate your life fully necessarily. Identities can be fragmented, discontinuous, and so forth. But the story structure suggests that it's possible to integrate some different parts of the story into all. Along the way, there have been influences in my work and others who study narrative identity within psychological science from philosophy. We are lay people reading philosophy, sometimes through secondary sources. I have to admit, although not always. So here are four influences in my own work. Not such a great shot there of Jean-Paul Sartre on the far left. And loved existentialism when I was an undergraduate, took courses in it. And I read a book in the early 80s. Oh, I gave it away, The Decade. Written by Stuart Charmé, called Meaning and Myth and the Study of Lives, a Sartrean Perspective. I don't know if anybody else has ever read it. But it really moved me. And he talked about how Sartre had this concept of a true novel. And the basic argument there was that, well, you know, human beings in the modern world, we don't really look to myths. Many people don't look to the animating myths of yesteryear anymore, those grand narratives to give our lives meaning and purpose. And so instead, we craft these little stories about who we are. And a true novel, well, what makes it a relevant kind of psychological phenomenon? Sartre said, well, first of all, it's your effort to try to find some meaning in the chaos of life. Ideally, a true novel should reflect something that is true about the epoch, the historical epoch within which you live. Had an influence on me along the way. Paul Ricoeur, of course, mentioned many times. You can't talk about narrative in philosophy without bringing Ricoeur's name into the game here. And Ricoeur argues, among other things, that human time is story time. That it's just sort of natural for human beings to kind of think about things in story terms. And this ramifies in so many different ways in the arts and sciences. Alistair McIntyre, in his book, McIntyre After Virtue, talks about sort of, you know, how a moral life, how a life that personifies Christian and Aristotelian virtues kind of can take the form of a narrative quest. It's an impact. And then that's Maria Schechtman. I don't know how many of you know her, a prominent philosopher at the University of Illinois, Chicago, who has written really, I think, moving and powerful accounts of how it is, she argues, that as storytellers, actually we move through life as authors, but also as protagonists of our own stories, and we're also audiences. We're sort of watching ourselves tell the story about how we are moving through life. All those roles kind of come together in contemporary sort of, in the narrative engagement that we have in life. So in empirical science, we have methods for collecting data, and the one that we usually use, and I have often used in our lab, is what we call a life story interview. So when I started thinking about the idea that people's lives, that people have life stories, and that those life stories are like, that's what their identity is, or that's what their narrative identity is. As a personality psychologist, I was thinking, well, I'd like to see what the different kinds of stories are. Because, you know, personality psychologists, the main thing we do, I don't know how many of you know about personality psychology necessarily. You could have a fine life and not know anything about personality. But you know, if you knew one thing about it, know that personality psychologists study variation. We're interested in how everybody's different from everybody else and how you can sort of categorize and classify. So we talk about traits and goals and motives and stories. Right? Everybody's got a different kind of story, but some stories resemble other stories a little bit. Maybe you can kind of categorize those. So we'll do a life story interview and ask you to think about your life as if it were a story or a chapter book, as it were. What are the main chapters in the novel of your life? Give me a title for each of those chapters and a quick plot summary. What are some of the key scenes, high points, low points, and turning points that stand out in your life story? What is the best thing that's ever happened in your life? We have people in the lab They come in one-on-one interviews, and we ask them these questions, and it's transcribed. And so, yeah, these people usually are in their 40s or 50s. I'm interested in midlife, by the way. And so that's often this, they've been telling their story for a long time. It's changed a lot over time. What's the worst thing that's ever happened in your life? And by the time you're 40 or 50, a lot of bad stuff's happened typically. I mean, bad for all of us that human suffering is so prevalent, but it's kind of good for the research. I mean, because how people narrate suffering, it's so powerful and it's so revealing and it's so important in your life. Who are the important characters, heroes, villains, and so forth in your life story? Where's your story going in the future? What's the next chapter going to be? What are some of the personal beliefs and values? And finally, we've been talking now for an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours in this interview. As I said, it's recorded, later transcribed, and we work with the texts. Do you see a motif or a theme or a message that captures what you've told me about in this life story? So we collect these from lots of different people in lots of walks of life, and under the idea that almost everybody has some kind of narrative understanding of their lives. There are a few people who don't, like that 45th president of the United States, actually doesn't have a narrative. That is maybe the most interesting thing about him. Beyond the narcissism, beyond the authoritarianism, is the narrative vacuum in the middle. But another talk, right? You could study all kinds of different sorts of individuals whose stories might be interesting. Let's talk about people who suffer from depression. We could do life narrative studies, they've been done on people who suffer from depression. Let's talk about people who are recent immigrants to this country. Let's do a systematic study of life narratives there. You could divide people up sociologically, ethnographically, or whatever. In a lot of my research, and Professor D. St. Albin was involved in this in the early days, I focused on this question. I said, well, generativity. Some of you don't know the word, maybe if you don't, maybe, but it basically refers to how caring and productive a person is. Erik Erikson, again, talked about generativity, that same man we talked about a minute ago, as the central psychosocial challenge of the midlife years. How can I do something to leave a positive legacy for the next generation? Through teaching, mentoring, parenting, leadership, people strive to be generative. But some people are more generative than others for various reasons. And so we developed self-report questionnaires to assess differences in generativity. How do these highly caring, generative, productive, midlife adults, how do they narrate their lives? And like, well, why them? Why generative people? Well, because I kind of admire them, right? And I aspire to be a generative person. I mean, generative people step up and they're trying to make a difference. And they take on leadership positions. And like, not everybody does that in their midlife years. There's a lot of other ways you can live, right? You can stay home and watch movies all day. You can shop. You can, wallow in your own self-needs. And sometimes that's really important. I mean, there are various ways to live. Highly generative adults, yeah, that's hard. It's hard to be generative. You need a good story if you're going to be a highly generative. Because these narrative identities, they're resources, they're psychological resources that we draw upon. And we all need these stories. Highly generative people, I wonder what kind of stories they tell to support a caring and productive life. So you first of all have to believe me when I tell you that there are such things as highly generative adults out there, and they are different from people who score lower on self-report measures like this. This is the items from what's called the Loyola Generativity Scale. Professor D. St. Albin and I, long before he was a professor, worked on these items and developed this scale. And it has items like, okay, I try to pass on knowledge I've gained from my experiences. Perhaps you've taken these self-report questionnaires, little quizzes and so forth, and you rate yourself on a 1 to 4 scale. You say, yeah, I do that a lot. Maybe I'm a 3. And somebody else says, no, I don't really do that much. They give themselves a 1. And yes, people lie. Everybody knows that. But they kind of all lie about the same amount. That's an assumption. And so there's a lot of variation on these scales. And people who score high on scales like this, people come to me for advice, I have a responsibility to improve the neighborhood in which I live. If you follow them up, and tons of studies have done this, they really are different, right? They're more involved in civic organizations. They enjoy broader family support. They enjoy better friendship networks. They tend to engage in certain kind of parenting practices that psychological research suggests are often valued in many different cultural contexts. They tend to be somewhat more political, a lot more politically involved. Not necessarily conservative or liberal, one or the other, that's equal, but involved, right? They vote. They often are engaged in religious activities of one kind or another, at least in the US. All right, so these people, there's a whole literature, what's called construct validation literature, to suggest that highly generative people are really different from less generative people. That's all been done. Okay, what kind of stories? What kind of stories do they tell? So let's look at one of them. Sorry for this. All right, so here's a short scene here from a 57-year-old woman, and what we call negative childhood scene. That's one of the questions or prompts in the interview. And this is a highly generative woman. We know that from self-report scales and other things independent of the interview. She says this: my negative child scene. I was in first grade and I was told that I had this terrible illness, this rheumatoid arthritis, and this comes up a lot in her interview. That would make my knees swollen and I was going to have to stay in bed. And at the Catholic school, the nuns, they were so great. I mean, they said, you know, you're very special. God would only do this to somebody very, very special. And so that gave a little kid an idea of, oh, so this isn't something that I should be feeling sorry for myself about. This should be, well, a gift. And I was stupid enough that I wanted it, but I'm telling you, it helped. It's a complicated memory here because she says it's negative, but it's also kind of positive. Right? She said, you know, I mean, I had this terrible illness. That's what makes it such a really bad story. But the nuns, they fed me this line about how God called me for this. But now I think that might have, I wouldn't believe that now at age 57. But at age 5, I completely believed it. It helped me a lot when I was young, recording with this moment. All right, so a couple of keys. The first is what we call early advantage. The narrator indicates that they have experienced an advantage or distinction, be it physical, material, relational, social, whatever, that singles them out for special positive attention. Oh, I'll probably something like this if you're about to store something, you know, like mom liked me the best, maybe, or you had a talent or a skill that was recognized early on. But would you make your life story sort of make that the opening thing? And highly generative adults will sometimes do that in the way that we see with this particular person. Does it just suggest that, you know, despite all the problems in life that exist, I think I was blessed. I think I had a lucky break. The nuns convinced me that I was special to have this moment. Redemption sequence is the second theme I want to focus on here. I'll come back to this later too. The narrator describes a movement from a demonstrably negative situation to a positive outcome. This is very common in life narrative accounts, where people will talk about going through something really bad, some sort of suffering or setback, and then come out of it in an enhanced state in some way. There's lots of different ways in which this plays out in people's life stories. So those are two themes to think about. We'll come back to them. But before we do that, let's look at a second scene from a man this time, turning point scene from a 55-year-old man who is also highly generative. And, you know, we asked for the biggest turning point in your life, and he picks a fight that he got into in 7th grade. I just find this an interesting choice. And after describing the fight, he says, I think it just says that you have to stand up. After that, after the fight, I used to do things like we had a boy a block over who had Down syndrome, and we didn't even know back then what Down syndrome was, but you just knew he was different. And I don't use the word retarded. I always hated that word. It was like a cause for me to defend him because other kids I didn't even know from other schools, try to get him to take his pants down and things like that, humiliate the kid. If I saw it, I would go over there and I would defend it. I didn't care how many kids there were there. And his name was Tom. The third theme I want to highlight, sensitivity to the suffering of others. The narrator expresses awareness of sympathy or pain or problems that other people experience, or shows a sensitivity to perils, dangers, and problems in society. Again, I'm sure you've got some scenes like this in your life story account. Highly generative adults, they accentuate these kinds of scenes. One more. Now your childhood scene from a 65-year-old white man. The fact that he is white is key here. I was probably in first grade, and my brother was probably 4 years old when we were playing in the front yard, bored out of our minds, as we always were. And our neighbor lady, she basically abducted us. It was a Sunday, I guess, and she took us to the Baptist church. And my mom, she let her do it, so she could get some sleep, and get some rest from us. So Billy, who was the younger brother, and I became devout Christians. And that was mainly good, but the church, it was all right. So when the blacks moved into the neighborhood, well, the church bus got rerouted so that it would not go down those streets. I was probably in 8th grade when that happened, and it bothered me a lot. I wanted to speak out against it, but I was afraid. I mean, there were serious racists in this church, including some of my friends. So I just shut up. Looking back, well, it was bad and good, I guess. I mean, I stayed with my Christian faith, but I rejected the racism. Still today, that is what I'm about. One of the reasons I volunteer in the food pantry, I support progressive candidates, is that I believe that I am doing God's work. When I do that, yeah, even if my childhood church had some backward ideas. A couple of themes here, 4 and 5. Enough of the themes. Moral steadfastness. The narrator emphasizes strong religious, political, or social values that motivate behavior. The values are central to their life. I mean, we all have values, but highly generative adults, their values are more important. They will tell you, okay? And they're central, and they're solid, and they've been there for a long time, and they don't change much, and they're a bedrock. And pro-social roles. The narrator sets forth and describes roles, plans, or hopes that involve contributing to the well-being of others beyond one's family. 5 themes I have pulled out for you from those 3 little accounts, and together they kind of create a type or a gestalt. Idealized, nobody's life story fits this perfectly by any means. It's kind of stripped down, but this is kind of how it goes. It starts out with the juxtaposition of early advantage and suffering of others. I'm blessed, but others suffer. Or I am the gifted protagonist who journeys forth into a dangerous world. Americans love stories. The gifted protagonist, the chosen one, called by the nuns because I had this bad illness or whatever. And the world is dangerous. There's bad stuff out there. We all know this, of course. And so, I kind of need to do something. It's my responsibility. Now, these stories are being told not at age 5. They're being told at age 55. And you're looking back. And you're a highly generative person. And so you kind of frame it that way. I think maybe I was so fortunate early on. There's a kind of gratitude that goes with it. And others, maybe not so much. And then I move forward in life, and I develop my values, as we all do. I develop some sort of political, religious, social sensibility, and it's a bedrock for me, man. Right? It is so solid and so strong. And then I keep moving, and bad stuff happens, because bad stuff always happens in stories. But in my life, oftentimes those bad things, they go good. Or something positive comes out of it down the road. And as I continue to move forward, I see the future, right? And I'm expecting, as a highly generative adult, even though I don't call myself that I will continue to engage in pro-social behaviors of various sorts. And even if the world is going to hell in a handbasket, And even if global warming is going to wreck it all, and God knows what's going to happen in the next election, right? Still in my neck of the woods, I'm making a difference. So this is the story, right? Stripped down. And yeah, I mean, a lot of things you could say about it, good and bad, really. But it seems to be the kind of narrative that highly generative American adults often tend to tell. Now, how do we know that? I can't just say it. Right? We actually have to test it empirically. It's really annoying in psychological science. And so here's kind of how we do it. And it's so simple-minded, I'm embarrassed, but you know, you gotta start somewhere. All right, so imagine there's 5 different scenes that you ask the participant to tell. High point, a low point, turning point, a life challenge, clues for future. We can put buttons up there. Our interviews ask for more of that. Let's just pull 5 chunks of the interview out. We pull 5 chunks of text, 5 separate chunks. And then for each chunk, we read it, human coders, you can't do this with computer algorithms, and we determine the extent to which each of those 5 themes, early advantage, suffering of others, moral steadfastness, redemption sequences, and pro-social goals, we determine the extent to which they are there. Like yes or no. Was it there in the story? And you train coders with manuals who separately read the stories and learn to develop a kind of what we call intercoding reliability, which is always a challenge. So here's an example. Here's subject number 1. We just made them up. And in this person's high point scene, there's a moral steadfastness and there's a pro-social goals. But the other 3 themes didn't show up. In the life challenge, we see a redemption sequence, and the other themes didn't show up. Usually the theme's not there. The themes don't come up, but when they're there, we mark it. Right? And then you kind of basically just add up the scores across the interview, and you do a bunch of interviews. And so here are data from a study, and for the data geeks, this is fine. For the rest of you, don't worry about it. I'll walk through it. 157 midlife adults. They were all interviewed, each one individually. This took forever, 2 years. And coding of it, just as much time. So each person is interviewed in this study, 157, but interviews are analyzed kind of in this sort of way. And what you see on the screen here are correlation of multiple pressure results, which effectively test the relation between the self-report indices that I'll describe in a moment, on the one hand, the psychosocial adaptation, psychosocial adaptation, and the other themes on the other. So the other themes go across the top, early advantage, suffering of others, so forth. The comp just means the composite, the total. And then these are 3 self-report psychological measures up and down. Generativity, which I've talked about, right? A person's concern for and commitment to promoting the well-being of future generations, which is the only thing we really care about in this slide. But also psychological well-being, which is not a small thing. And that's important for all of us. And it turns out generativity and well-being are often somewhat possible. And then a measure of depression. And it turns out that these themes, as they appear in the stories, are positively associated with both generativity and psychological well-being, which means that people who score high on measures of caring for and commitment to promoting the well-being of future generations, and who also, by the way, happen to score high on well-being, their life stories tend to be more highly saturated with these themes that comprise the redemptive self, the 5. Compared to who? Compared to people who score low on measures of generativity and psychological well-being. And it's all probabilistic. Right? You can pull a case out, number 47, that defies the laws completely. Maybe case 47 is high in generativity, self-report score in generativity, and there's no redemptive self in there. Yeah, there's always exceptions. But it's a general tendency. And for psychological research of this sort, these are pretty robust findings. Some of you who are more psychologically oriented may know about trait psychology and the big 5 traits. If you don't, that's okay. The point here is that the redemptive self is also correlated with 4 of these big 5 trait dimensions of personality in positive ways. Extroversion tends to refer to the extent to which a person has social energy and positive emotionality. that's positively associated with redemptive self. So are conscientiousness and agreeableness, which are the great socializing traits, the traits about working hard, conscientiousness being self-controlled, self-discipline, and agreeableness being warm, kind, and caring, positively associated with the redemptive self story. And neuroticism, which is a bad thing, you wouldn't know that, right? Just from the name of it, yeah, it is bad. It's about negative emotionality and so forth. It tends to be negative associated. Openness is the interesting thing, again, for the psychology specialists out there. It's more cognitive openness. It's about like how liberal-minded, how open-minded, how intellectually adventurous you are. It's also somewhat associated with cognitive ability overall. Academics like us, way off the map on openness, right? Law enforcement, usually a little bit low on openness. There's, people differ on the spectrum. Interestingly, not related at all. And I like this, the redemptive self. The redemptive self story is not a highfalutin narrative that academics tell about necessarily. It isn't, or it's not related to that one way or another. It's not elitist, I think. It's a story that is grounded in many people's lived experience, and you don't need to have a college degree. You don't need to be especially open-minded and creative and artistically inclined to create kind of story to your life. Now, I believe that 85% of me believes, or I should say 85% of the time, I'm not sure how to say it, I think this is a good story, mostly, about 85%. This redemptive story. I think there's some really good things about it. I've already indicated one. It sets up that moral challenge. I'm blessed, others suffer. You're a highly generative adult out there trying to make a difference in the world, caring and productive. You're involved in politics, maybe you're trying to make your community better. You engage in all kinds of activities that less generative adults say, oh my God, why did you do that? Wears me out thinking about it. So this kind of story, it sort of says, well, I guess I should be doing this, because after all, I had these early advantages. I had these memories of like early on being special in a good way. And the world is bad and dangerous. It needs me out there. So yeah, good. Also, redemption sustains hope. So generative adults don't have it easy, as I suggested early on. Your political candidate won't win all the time. The things you're trying to accomplish in your neighborhood might not work out. Your students may disappoint you. Your children will disappoint you. There's lots of bad things that happen in life, and highly generative adults, their generativity almost brings it on. It's like they're inviting defeat. But if you got a story that says, yeah, well, a lot of bad things have happened. Remember that first marriage? Oh my God, that was a disaster. I just got nowhere with that, felt trapped, felt oppressed. Thank God got out of that, moved on to something good. You got those kinds of things, setbacks that turn positive, be they interpersonal, be they instrumental, whatever. That's what your story tells you, that maybe you're better positioned, psychologically speaking, to be a generative adult. And when bad things come around with respect to generativity, you look to your life story and you say, yeah, but a lot of times good things follow. So this kind of story, I think for many Americans, seems coherent. It seems familiar. It's coherent in two senses. It provides a kind of temporal coherence that people really get. This idea that you're on a journey and bad things occur and challenges and you overcome them. Or maybe you just get lucky and get through them, but you get through them in some way. And then the next challenge arises. So it kind of links your life together in a temporal sense. This kind of story, other stories do too, but I think this one has a certain kind of coherence in it. And then the motivation is behind it. So the narrative ideas that are coherent makes sense to us because we understand the motivations of the protagonist. And the motivations of this particular protagonist, I think, are understandable. And finally, this kind of story It may not be universally valued, I'm not going to go there, but it's culturally valued, at least in the United States. There are many examples of these kinds of stories that people hold up. But I would argue that redemptive self is a master narrative culture. A master cultural narrative in American society. Psychologists in recent years have talked a lot about master cultural narratives. These are broad, almost ubiquitous narratives out there in culture that tell you how to live your life. A lot of times these stories are oppressive. And they surely have, even in their best expressions, they almost always have a certain kind of hegemonic feel to them, in the sense that these are the stories that come from privilege. Psychologically speaking, highly generative adults are kind of privileged in terms of the psychology of it. They've got a quality here, generativity, that really is valued and that does seem to help them and make their life better and make other people's lives better if the research is to be believed. And so these master narratives, sometimes oppressive, sometimes problematic, but at the same time, they can also provide resources, cultural resources, like cultural literary resources out there to promote, in this case, a highly generative life. There are so many examples going back in American mythos, heritage, of redemptive narratives that Americans hold dear. And people sort of know this, right? So whether you're talking about stories like Benjamin Franklin's Rags to Riches or Horatio Alger stories or immigrant stories that turn out positive, those kinds of narratives, Americans sort of know them. They know stories about escaped slaves who become free, narratives of emancipation are another way in which redemptive stories play out. And people sometimes, they plagiarize. They take those cultural narratives and, it's mine right there, grab it, and then pull it in with their own lived experience. Yes, I'm living a life of emancipation, perhaps, or I'm living a life of recovery. These sorts of narratives are very powerful. Presidents know about them. Presidents know about them. Politicians know about them. 3 of the last 4 presidents tell extraordinary redemptive stories of their lives. And these are 3 very different men. George W. Bush, right? His life story, it's not, what he thought it was going to be. Growing up in Texas, his dad being one of the most prominent Republican politicians anywhere, George H.W. Bush, who was also president, as you all know. Widely admired was George H.W. Bush, even by a lot of Democrats. George W. Bush, the firstborn son, who's got the first name, same name, he's going to be just like his dad, except he's nothing like his dad. His dad's this scholar athlete at Yale who goes on and makes it rich in the oil in the oil business, and has friends all over the world, and one incredible thing after another, and a pilot in World War II who was shot down and awarded. George W. Bush, none of him doing it. He was a terrible student, not a good athlete. But somewhere along the way, after squandering maybe 15 years of his life with alcoholism, in his 30s, he comes up with a different story for his life. It's the prodigal son. This is the boy who goes off to seek his fortune and just screws it up totally through drunkenness and messing around and not staying straight on the narrow, and eventually comes back to his roots, tries to turn things around, and he does by, first of all, 1, meeting this lady Laura and become married to her, and she helps to stabilize him, and they have a couple kids. 2, having a religious conversion experience in April of 1984, I believe, in a Holiday Inn restaurant with a preacher named Arthur Blessed, and he let Jesus into his heart. He did that evangelical salvation thing. Some of you may have done it. I did it when I was like in 5th grade, back when I was a Baptist. Still Baptist anymore, but it was a big thing for me back then. Big thing for George W. Bush. And then on his 40th birthday, after his 40th birthday party, where he had quite a bit to drink, which he often did, he said, "That's it, I'm done." He gave it up. And if the public records believe, and I believe it, he hasn't had a drink since, right? He tells this story about his life. It's a redemptive narrative, and he believes that the story is as responsible as anything else for the success that he later enjoyed. He became governor, he became president. You know, he may not like his politics, but he did become president. He enjoyed some success in his life. He sees himself as a generative person. The redemptive story is key. Barack Obama, very different story, right? No self-inflicted wounds like that, but equally redemptive. It's a story about progress. It's a story about hitching his own identity to this grand American narrative of progress, which begins with the civil rights movement and moves forward to the women's movement and to more contemporary movements regarding LGBTQ and so forth. I mean, it's that story. And Obama sees himself as part of it. In this book is one of his autobiographies, Dreams from My Father, which he wrote when he was in his 30s. He's just unabashedly, shamelessly embracing this story. You know, it's kind of his friends sort of rolling their eyes, "Oh, come on. Like, no, this is my story. Martin Luther King Jr., this is my story. I'm going to be part of this narrative." I took it very, very seriously. And of course, he is who he is to a great extent. He's got this strongly redemptive narrative identity. It's very different than Bush's. And then maybe the most redemptive of them all is Biden, current president, right? Talk about suffering and you know, just a tragedy hitting. I mean, you all probably know a lot about it, but I mean, he's 29-year-old, just elected to the Senate in 1972, and a few days away from when he's going to be sworn in, his wife and their daughter are killed in an automobile accident. And the two boys, Hunter and Bo, who were like 4 and 3, or maybe 5 and 2 at the time, I can't remember the ages, banged up pretty bad, and they're in a cast, body cast, and they're in the hospital. And that's where Biden is sworn in. You should see the photos. And Biden is grim. Like, his face is just like death. But he's being sworn into the Senate. These poor kids are here in a cast. Well, okay, things turn around a bit. But then there's a second tragedy, the loss of his firstborn son, Bo, back in 2015 to brain cancer. Biden writes about this in a very powerful way. He talks about it in his speeches and so forth in this book, Promise Me Dad. And you know, Biden, he believes in American redemption. It's kind of hokey sometimes, a little cliche. Well, actually, all three of these presidents, and maybe you have to just be that way. Well, no, you don't. But 3 of the last 4, unabashedly sort of like committed to this kind of story from their life, and then you sort of see it as part of your country. Almost like Sartre talked about it, in the sense of a true novel, I guess. I mean, you feel that your story captures something that's true about your time and place. Last topic, real quick. I wanted to put this in because it connects a little bit to previous talk. People who study narrative identity in psychological science, a large number of them have an interest in race, ethnicity. It's not a random sample of psychological scientists. You know, first of all, people who study narrative identity are a little unusual to begin with, and then this focus on race and ethnicity and class and so on, gender and so forth, is a very strong theme in a lot of the research. So I want to say a few words about it in the context of the redemptive self, very limited speculative based on some of our own, some new work coming out in our lab. And I want to make a distinction here. I've never really played this out before, so I'm interested in your response to it. It's way oversimplified, but I think it's an interesting thing. There are lots of different ways in which people tell redemptive stories about their lives. And we have noticed over the years, having strongly sampled communities of color, especially focused on African-American participants in our studies who tend to be in their midlife years. So these are effectively African-American baby boomers and maybe a little younger who are usually in our studies with correspondingly Euro-American baby boomers, and so forth. And first of all, you see some of the most powerful indications of redemptive stories in the African-American community. This is just qualitative. I haven't sort of, well, we actually do have some quantitative evidence to suggest that African-Americans score a little higher on that theme than do whites. It's not a huge difference, but it comes up a lot, this idea of redemption. They also have a lot of that moral steadfastness in their stories, which I think partly reflects the African-American church and the salience of that in the African-American community. There's other things going on too. Right. And so in a lot of these stories, there is the quality of the redemptive narrative is one of overcoming adversity. Right? And the story, it's sort of like the story is situated this way that, you know, the idea that the world's a dangerous place, really, it really is, right? Not too many of our African African-American participants will talk about childhood as this, oh, glorious, unbelievably idyllic period. They don't tell fairy tales like that, like those Euro-American fairy tales where once upon a time in a faraway place, everything was kind of cute, and nice, and beautiful. It's not Disney like that at all. It's often, there was peril. There was peril early on. And there's this sense that even if they've made it and are well-established and highly generative adults in our studies, I mean, they're not necessarily rich and well-off socially and economically, but psychologically, they've got a lot going for them. So in that sense, they are very, very successful. Even then, there's this sensibility that, you know, it all could fall apart. You got to really be careful. So overcoming adversity, soldiering through the toughest times, getting through the tribulations, whatever they may be, that's just such a powerful idea. Whites talk about that too, but it seems to be a little bit more salient. And so I'm thinking of, you know, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., here, Toni Morrison, you know, the kind of novels and stories and speeches projected by these great African-American icons. They're not always about overcoming adversity, but that certainly is a theme that runs through. But there's a lot of other ways to talk about narrative identity. Take George W. Bush's narrative story. So in his case, it's about, he grew up in Midland, Texas, and it was great. It was so fun. And his parents were great, and his friends were great, and he was innocent, and he was happy, and they played out in the fields, and wasn't all glorious, and then bad stuff happened. He started drinking, all kinds of trouble, and he needed to recover the goodness that he lost. He wants to get the good back, right? And then grow. So there is these themes of growth and recovery. I mean, they come up a lot in redemptive stories for both African Americans and Euro Americans in our studies. But there's something a little bit more white about them, I think. There's something that they come up a little bit more, I think, or actually we have data to suggest they do come up more. Ariana Turner, a graduate student of mine, has put together research to suggest that these stories of growth and recovery are somewhat more prevalent among whites, whereas the stories of overcoming adversity are somewhat more prevalent among the African American participants in our studies. And what are these stories about? Well, they're kind of like humanistic psychology. It's almost as if some of these highly generative, redemptive women and men have read Carl Rogers. That's who that is, right? Some of you know him in psychology. I mean, he's the psychologist of optimism and hope, and everything's great. Humanistic psychology, self-actualization, unconditional positive regard. Ralph Waldo Emerson on the far right was an apostle of this philosophy in the early 19th century. He argued that each person out there has something good inside them. He called it intuition. And you just have to get it out. You gotta find it and pull it out, but it's good. It's good. And if you can discover it and recover it, because you had it once and you knew about it when you were little, get it back, pull it out, then you can grow and develop and self-actualize And well, Americans love stories like that. And then there's an emphasis on self-care, on continuing to evolve and grow. And there's this sense that the world is kind of benevolent. It's going to let you do this. Erickson wrote like this too. He kind of had a faith that it's kind of going to be okay. And these stories sort of have that belief that basically it's all right out there, and you're going to grow and develop, and you'll recover that goodness. And well, there's a luxury kind of thing that goes with that, but not everybody can relate to. So this is just some differences that I think are interesting. And then a lot of people put both of them together. Have redemptive stories that pull both from growth and overcoming adversity. And this person is the greatest example, Oprah Winfrey. In my mind, the most significant spokesperson for the redemptive self in the world, right? And through her television shows, book club and so forth, Oprah told a story that was both about overcoming adversity and about growth in her own life. And more importantly, she taught other people, still does, teaches other people how to tell their story that way too. Kind of like an apostle. And here's the good news. I'm going to spread it to the four corners of the world. And there's a goodness inside you. You just have to pull it out. But their story's also very gritty. Right? And it's about overcoming abuse, and it's about soldiering through tough times. And she grew up really poor, and she was sexually abused early on. And I mean, it pulls from both sides. And she is something of a larger-than-life character in this regard. And I find it interesting that, at least according to a Newsweek interview about 15 years ago, Oprah was talking about what she preaches and how she promulgates these stories for Americans. She said, I often consult these little things I've got in my purse. And so she pulls out these little quotations, and they're from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Quotations about growth and recovery. And then, of course, her life also pulls in one the other. So just some thoughts at the end here about sort of variation. I mean, personality psychologists are interested in variation. But the basic take home, I think, is that people are storytellers. Redemptive stories have a certain cachet in American society. There are some negative sides to that, which we can talk about. Some people think they're very naive. I kind of agree most of the time. Some people will say that they're a little bit self-righteous, definitely. We've met many highly generative adults. They often have a little bit of that. I think a little bit guilty on that myself. But still, I think there's something very life-affirming about these redemptive stories. And maybe we want to think more seriously about the variations out there that may be a function of class, ethnicity, and race. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for Q&A, which I'm going to moderate, take the questions and whatnot.
Hey, Dan, thanks. I'd like to hear you talk a little more about the coherence part of the redemptive self. Professor Ortega talked about the nonlinear. You can take the story and break it open at any point, and it's not necessarily connected to the other things. And we had a question on what's a good story, and it sounds a little bit like you're suggesting, coherence is one indicator of this redemptive, positive story. And I'm wondering, its relation to kind of social power, people that have those positions. But also, they kind of tied into the day's theme, right? In clinical psychology, there's a really clear literature that people coming out of trauma don't tell coherent stories initially. And part of therapy is actually to increase the coherence of the trauma story. So again, kind of the assumption being the more coherent, the healthier the story, the better the story. But it seems like for some, going to your last point, it may not be possible to tell, right? If you're living in a really, lower position on kind of the hegemonic scale, it's difficult to tell a linear, clear, coherent story. So just how do you kind of see coherence as an indicator of health and healing? And also how do you see it in relation to kind of social power status?
So there's coherence and then there's coherence. So basic coherence is just understandability. So you tell me something, we're in a particular cultural context, you tell me something, and I say, that doesn't make any sense. I just don't understand the relation. I don't understand the temporality of it, you know, how A can go to B can go to C. Right? So that's fundamental. And so within a given cultural context, there are agreed upon rules as to what constitutes a coherent narrative. And if you have a hard time telling that, then I mean, studies have suggested that can be a psychological, that can lead to some psychological problems. But you're totally right, in a more general kind of way, and that is that, you know, the story has to be true to lived experience, right? And so I can't just, you know, I've had certain experiences in my life, and I decided, you know what, I'm just going to make it up completely differently. I don't know how many of you have seen the Hulu series Dropout, which is about Elizabeth Holmes. She's that woman in Silicon Valley who developed this Theranos company, and it was all fraud. She was recently convicted in court, but she told an incredibly coherent story about her life, about the company, and so forth. And it brought everybody, all kinds of people bought it. Bill Clinton, George Shultz, all the people invested, right? And it was all bogus. It had nothing to do with her lived experience. And it also didn't have anything to do with like, physical reality. And so, yeah, I mean, you can't expect coherence all the time. I think stories try to make some coherence out of it. And I think therapists, as you suggest, do as well. Although sometimes you come into therapy, you say, you know, you see everybody's against you, right? That kind of paranoid ideation, and you know, everything I do is wrong. And it's pretty coherent. It makes all kinds of psychological sense. And what the therapist might be trying to do is like get you out of that coherence and shake you up a little bit. And maybe it would be better if your story had a few more loose ends in it and a few inconsistencies. So, okay, yeah, all right, things went bad there, but how about over here? And you don't need to connect them all the time. You don't have to find a narrative connection there. People have many stories. I mean, so there's lots of different ways to go with that.
Yeah.
So actually going on into this, I'm interested in your sample sizes and the populations you're pulling from, particularly the Black American, because it seems like with this generative identity and redemptive story, there also seems to be an aspect of self-deception and some sort of vision happening to the sort of white sides of this idea that we're chosen, which seems super problematic, and perhaps in the social context there is this aspect of being chosen by society. And so it makes me curious then, deception is also playing a crucial part of this narrative of this identity. And we tell our stories in a deceiving way, as if we are not, as Maria said, the oppressor in spaces. And especially also going into this question on the issue of the five, I think it was negatively coordinated, but of neuroticism. So we're talking about populations who are dealing with entire trauma depression. And then it seems that they're not then candidates or not necessarily fitting into the five aspects of generative identity, because these are people who are still having fragmented stories, who are disproportionately subjected to T-symptom symptoms, who are also living anxiously in America, who might actually have the belief that after them, if we look at terms of violence or immigration. And so I wonder that in this trying to make a neat redemptive story or a neat according to like generative personality, how much of that is very much steeped in the racialization of the United States, specifically playing into white American stories of heroism, of being able to deceive ourselves that there are heroes in this situation. And yeah, I'm trying to like make a more comparing question, but I feel like it's extremely relevant that this aspect of deception.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Let me
Sorry.
pick up a couple of points and then you could elaborate. First of all, in terms of sample sizes, I mean, it's a lot of people who like narrative research do case studies, one after another, and that's good. I've done some of that, but a lot of my colleagues are much more invested. It's purely qualitative, it's inductive, it's great. My niche is to try to do some quantitative stuff with this. And so we try to get sample sizes where you can test hypotheses. But it is so labor intensive to do these interviews. And so that one had 157 participants, approximately half of whom were African American, half of whom were white. Yeah, I mean, it's hardly a random sampling of Americans, but it's more than one. And so, and we've done numerous studies, but yeah, sample sizes are relatively small compared to people who do internet studies and get like 10,000 participants in an afternoon through questionnaires. We're not doing that. So yes, there are limits in generalizability given sample sizes and so forth. And you asked about self-deception. That's narrative identity to a certain extent, right? I mean, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Joan Didion quoting that. It's not true, right? I mean, was she really called, right? You know, people have all kinds of interesting stories about like things went right or things went wrong in their lives. Right? Are they true? No, probably not. Who knows? They're unknowable. And so people need to come up with reasons. And so they create stories. And so there's going to be some deception there. Nonetheless, as with coherence, there's deception and there's deception. And so when your story is like blatantly false in the way Elizabeth Holmes's was, or in the way a person who claims A when everybody else knows B, then there's problems. And the problems are trust. People can't trust you, okay? They can't, and these stories are built within communities. And so I know Ed knows, we know each other, we know each other's stories, and we can't trust each other if in fact one of us is, projecting an image that is grossly goes against reality. We talk about how stories often reproduce power differentials, right? I think there is something to that with all these narratives here, and to a certain extent. I mean, I'm not sampling. Some of these participants are politically very active, and they may be way over on the left, but some of them are way over on the right too, okay? And I'm kind of like trying to sort of find commonalities. And so for some people, their redemptive story is in some way or another an affirmation of the status quo, and they may be implicitly or maybe sometimes explicitly, kind of like reinforcing the hegemonic structures. In other cases, a lot of my participants, they don't know much about that kind of thing. I mean, these aren't academics for the most part. The whites, blacks, whoever's in the participant in the pool, they're pretty well educated, and they're going along in life, but they're not up on these issues that we as academics struggle with. And there are, and I don't know, maybe this is disappointing to me actually, the idea that social forces, broad social cultural forces, economic and so forth, that doesn't come up in the life stories. Now maybe it's just the questions we're asking, but we don't get a lot of discourse about culture, about the structures of societies. And so most of these people, they feel good about who they are, they feel they're making a difference, and they have a story that supports that, even if they've struggled a lot.
Yeah, thank you. This is interesting. I have a question about if you have any, hypotheses about where causal connections lie here. Are these people, mostly middle-aged folks, telling these stories, are they generating those stories back in the day? And then those stories are actually helping them become generative people? Or are they rationalizing it after the fact? Because, that's going to make a big difference. It's one thing for someone to generate a story that, I think this always happens with athletes. I worked so hard, worked every day, and I became an NBA player. Yeah, you're also qualified. So I wonder, to what extent these stories are those who are already primed before the telling of the stories, either kind of be to tell these stories.
We don't know, but it's got to know. It's correlational research, so we don't know what causes what. But your question is really excellent. It kind of gets at another thing that's in this kind of research in general. Are you generative because you've got a redemptive story, or do you have a redemptive story because you're generative? And I think there's something to be said for both. We do know that people's stories change a lot over time, so I don't think back in the day they necessarily were telling the same kind of story, but they may have been somewhat predisposed to see the world in redemptive patterns early on in life, perhaps, and that may ultimately filter into how they tell stories about it. And so there is some of that. I like the idea of the kind of after-the-fact rationalization, although I don't see that as a negative, because I think these stories really do provide you with resources going forward, even if they are after-the-fact rationalizations. And I think highly generative people, it's kind of like that. I mean, you wake up one morning and you realize, oh my God, I'm having a big impact on the world. And I'm like, wonder why? Maybe it's because of the nuns back in the day. Maybe it has to do with Tommy and how I used to defend him in those fights. So a lot of it is that. It's being cast in a way that fits your current situation. And there's a lot of evidence from cognitive science that suggests that autobiographical memory is often in the service of future goals. What are these people's future goals? They want to continue to make a difference. They want to change their community. They want to have an impact on their family. That's their future goals. So they need a story that supports that. And these redemptive stories, there are other kinds of stories too that would work, but these redemptive stories seem to be pretty effective.
Any plans on longitudinal studies?
Yeah, we've done some longitudinal studies, but you'd have to go decades, right, to really kind of piece that. But these data actually come from a longitudinal study. I just talked about year one. It's a 9-year study, but we're following people. But it's like age 55 to 65. Oh my God, they're so cool. Nothing changes during those years. And actually, there is some evidence that suggests that a lot does not change during those years, like personality traits, for example. So maybe that was a bad choice, picking that age range. The other thing, implicit, I don't know if you meant it, but it's an interesting thing that comes out of your question, and that's cohort. These are very important. Do millennials tell redemptive stories about their life? Will Gen Z tell redemptive stories about their life when they get into life? And I don't know. There are always going to be people who are committed to making positive use of the world, or can be productive, who step up, be parents, leaders, and so on. Generativity forever, okay, until the planet dies. But what kind of stories are going to support those generative efforts? It may change by generation.
I wonder if, because one of the things that is interesting to me is that you're making sort of a normative claim, as we say in philosophy, which means that you're actually giving, you're claiming that this kind of narrative is good in a certain sense. And I wonder if the reason that is that it is good is because of the kinds of values or the kinds of things we value in a certain society, right? So lately I've been watching Russian movies about World War II. And one of the things that is really interesting to me is the notion of the hero, right? When I compare it to American movies or World War II. And so the hero in American movies is sort of the Superman, right? This triumphant and winning hero, whereas in Russian movies, the hero is the person who sacrifices herself for her motherland, right? And so I wonder if we take these Russian films about World War II as narratives, right? They are reflecting sort of a set of values that do not correspond to the American set of values, and this is partly why the stories look so different. But then in that sense, I wonder if, the normative claim in other cultures or other, that emerge from other sort of set of values would be different, and if perhaps not redemptive stories would be also the good stories.
That's a great example, I think, of the idea that mass cultural narratives don't travel necessarily from one culture to the next. There are highly generative people worldwide, Russia, the United States, everywhere, but what are the stories that are valued in that culture? And what are the values that are personified in those stories? And I think your example of the heroes in these World War II Russian movies suggest a different value, somewhat different set of values, a different understanding of what it means to be a good person, a different understanding of what a good life is. Not totally different. It's not like we don't recognize it, right, from another culture, but different enough. And I think the redemptive, I think those stories probably are, if they're redemptive in a different way. And probably maybe you don't want to use that term for that kind of narrative. But I think the normative claim, you can make it in a limited way, the way psychologists make it, culture by culture, by saying, well, it's associated with things that we truly believe are good, like generativity, right? So if in a given culture you find that a certain life narrative form tends to be linked to generativity, and generativity being valued everywhere, then you could say, well, that seems to be a pretty good story, at least for some people in that culture. So in that, yeah, that is kind of how the normative works. Great example. Others? Lunch, right? Let's think of lunch. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it's something related to Dustin's question, but maybe I'll focus on this part of it. So in the point which you said, I think that we need a story to be highly generative. And I'm wondering how to understand the needs thing here. And so I came up with two possibilities, maybe they're both wrong, but one which was just sort of, look, psychologically, we kind of need these stories to keep us sort of energized and moving, despite the odds, right? It's difficult to tasking and exhausting. But then I was thinking, you might also be thinking of a stronger sense of need that, if you have some project really changing the world, and you're looking around the world to see if it's possible, there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's a foolish task, it's not rational to undertake it, right? And so that without the help of this kind of story, it couldn't seem to you like a rational undertaking.
Right.
And so that would be a stronger sense of need. I think it generates concerns about how much you're okay with saying that the redemptive story can be just self-deceptive. It might be overly simplified or something like that, right?
No, I think that's great. I mean, it goes to that question on the both of those senses of need, I think, could be gotten. Okay. Erickson, even sunny, optimistic Erickson, knew that generativity was hard, and was asked once, well, how is it that some people who are really raising kids, but they don't seem very generative? And Erickson says, well, because they don't have a belief in the species. That's his term. Belief in the species. Well, what is that? It could be some kind of deception project, right? Things are really bad out there. And if you're trying to make a difference, I don't know, it might not be smart to do. So it could be that these kinds of stories have enough self-deception in them that they send you on the fool's errand of trying to make the world a better place. But having said that, these people who tell these kinds of stories do enjoy psychological well-being, and they do seem to be having some positive effect in the limited ways we can show it in psychological research. So if it is deceptive, there are some benefits, it seems to be. Maybe it's a little bit like that first little story where she says, yeah, I was stupid enough to believe it, but I'm telling you it helps. It's almost like saying, yeah, I was stupid enough to develop a redemptive story, but it kind of helped. I think maybe
Good.
it's lunchtime.
Yeah, let's do lunch. Thank you.